Want to learn how to build something like this in Python, your own desktop app? Get the skills that you need to then build even more complicated desktop apps using Python, adding text fields, buttons, pop-up boxes, for instance. Something like this could be shown in a pop-up box. Maybe you want to have these skills in your Python arsenal. In this video, I'm going to give you a tutorial on how to use Tkinter to basically create any type of GUI, graphical user interface, using Python. I'm going to explore the basics of Tkinter, which is the standard GUI library that comes with Python. It's bundled. And by the end of this tutorial, you'll understand the foundational concepts and be able to create your very first graphical user interface application. And by the end of this, you'll feel completely confident using Tkinter to create anything you want when it comes to creating graphical apps within Python. So what is Tkinter? How is it even pronounced? Is it Tkinter? Is it Tkinter? Is it Tkinter? You can call it whatever you like, I don't really mind, but it is a built-in library for creating graphical user interfaces, or GUIs, depending on your parlance. It allows you to add windows, buttons, text fields, and even more to your applications, all with just a few lines of code. And if you're familiar with graphical interfaces, it won't be that hard to wrap your head around. And the best part is that it's included with Python, so you don't even need to install anything extra to get started. It is there and ready to use right away. But before we jump into the code, I want to understand quickly the key building blocks of a Tkinter application. So to begin with, we have the main window. This is the foundation of your app, and we create this with the TK class, which you'll see when we dive into the coding window. Then we have widgets. Now these are the components like labels, buttons, and text fields. And we obviously add our widgets to the main window. And finally, we have the event loop. Tkinter uses an event-driven model. So once you set up your app, the main loop method keeps it running, waiting for user interactions. And that's it. If you can understand those three concepts, you already understand the key building blocks of any Tkinter application. So now I think the best thing to do is to learn by doing. We're going to dive into our Python code editor, and we're going to create a simple app with a label, a text field, and a couple of buttons. And all you've got to do is follow along with me in your favorite Python editor, and before you know it, you'll have your own code appearing on the screen, you'll have your own application appearing on the screen, and everything's going to be fun. Hopefully you're going to find this enjoyable. That's my goal. So here I am inside Visual Studio Code. I've got a new Python file set up, and I'm going to get straight stuck in. We're going to start with our import. So we're going to import Tkinter, and it's standard practice to import this as TK. Okay. Then from this, we're going to import some more things. What do I want to import? Well, I want to import a message box, and I'm going to use this message box to create a message box to send a message to the user. You can import many different things, but we're going to keep this simple for this foundational project. We're going to import a message box. Great. So we've imported the module. We've imported it as TK to give it a shorter alias, which is standard practice and a good thing to do. We've made the code therefore easier to write and read because you'll often reference Tkinter functions. And we've imported the message box submodule for displaying pop-up messages. Great, we're off to a flying start. Okay, what do we want to do next? Well, we need to create our window. What are we going to do? We're going to create something called root. This is standard, and we're going to say it's tk.tk. This is how we create our root object for any Tkinter application. You always have the root object, and it's typically done like this. Then we're going to set our basic. We're going to set the title of the window, geometry, which is the size, and we're going to use configure to set something like the background color. So if you think about it like this, root object is the window. It is the main application window. So when I call it the root object, really I'm referring to the main window. And this main window is where we're going to add things like widgets, which are going to be labels and text fields and buttons, etc. So root is main window. We've got that set. Now let's create our title, set a geometry, and we're going to add a background color. So to do that, we set the attribute, which is root.title. We're then going to pass in a string, and we're going to say, let's just call it basic Tkinter app. I think that's a reasonable idea. Now the geometry, okay. And within this, we pass in a string, but this is going to be pixels of width by height. So I would just say 400 by 300 is 400 pixels wide by 300 pixels tall. Okay, that's how it always works. And then finally, what do we need to do next? Okay, we need to use the configure attribute to maybe set the background color. And how do we do that? All right, well, root.configure. Then I'm going to pass in a keyword argument, and I'm going to say it is BG, in fact, BG for background. And let's just pass in a hex code, and let's just say F4. Okay, we've now passed in the color, and that has configured background of our main window. And there we go. We've now created our very first main window in Tkinter. Wasn't that easy? I think you found that pretty straightforward. All right, now what we're going to do is add some widgets to our app. And we're going to start with a label. Widgets, in my opinion, are the building blocks of your GUI, and you've got to use these within any Tkinter app, of course. Let's begin with a label. So I'm going to create a new variable called label. I'm going to make this a tk.label object, And then we've got a bunch of attributes that we're going to set here. So first of all, what we need to do is that we need to send in the root parameter to indicate that this label belongs to the main application window. So it always starts with root. So we're saying, hey, this widget is for the root window. Perfect. Now let's set the text for our label. And we're going to say it is welcome to Tkinter. Great. What else could we do? Well, we could set the font. So obviously we've got a label widget. We're saying it's assigned to the main window. We're saying here's the text I want to display. But what else could we do? Well, we want to specify the font type, maybe the size, and even the style. For instance, it could be bold. So again, I'm going to use the font keyword argument there. I'm going to say, all right, I want to use Arial as my font, passing in a string for size 16, and then for style bold, also a string. Great. What else could I set in here? Well, I could set the background. Okay. And again, I could set this to be what I did before, which is F4, F4, F4. Okay, and this is the background text colors. And obviously we could use the foreground as well. So we want the background to match in with our main window so it blends in, otherwise it might be white and it looks a bit ugly. And then we can set the foreground color, which is obviously pretty standard. That's the text color itself. So let's say foreground, which is FG, we're going to pass in hex code of 333. Excellent. Right, we have now created our first label object. And there it is. Fairly straightforward, I think you'd agree. Now, the last thing we need to do is use the pack method to place the label in the window. And we can also add some padding. So I'll add some padding in Y, which is vertical padding. So to do this, it's simply label.pack. This is therefore going to place the label in the window. And then within that, I'm going to add some padding, add Y equals 20. Now, this is optional. I don't have to pass this in. I could just do pack and then add it to the window and it's all set. Padding is optional. Great. So we've now created a label to display text. So what do we want to do next? How about we create a text field? And you're going to see that we're following the same principles each and every time when we create widgets. It's going to seem pretty repetitive, you might say. But once you get your head around how it works, you'll feel really confident with using Tkinter for creating GUIs. So let's say we're going to call our variable text field. We're going to call it tk.entry because the entry object within the tk class is going to give us a text field. We are passing root again. Why? Because we are associating it with the root, the main window. Let's say we want the font within this text field to be the following. So I'm going to pass in Arial and I'm going to say that's the font type. In terms of font size, let's go with 14. Great. So we've set the font type and size for the user input. Now let's specify the width, which is the number of characters visible in the text field. So I can say width equals 25. So we'll see 25 characters. And then finally, we do the same things before. We're going to use the pack method to place the widget within our window. And then we're going to use padding again, just to add some padding. So text field dot pack add Y equals, let's add 10. Okay, we've now created a label and a text field. We've got two widgets. We're making great strides. So what we want to do next, we want to add a button. Now, here's what's different with buttons. Obviously, when you press buttons, you expect something to happen, right? You click on a button, expect an action. So what we need to do is we need to actually create a function, which is going to be passed in as our command to the button. And this function is going to do something. So we need a button for, let's say, submitting input. And then we need a command parameter, which is going to link the button to a function. And we could call this function, for instance, submit action. And what we could do within this function, say, is we could retrieve the text from the input field using the get method and then display it in a pop-up message. So we're tying everything together. This is a really straightforward modality, but it explains to you just how you use these widgets and how they all tie together with their important functions, which in this case is a command. So how about to begin with, we will just create a blank function. We'll create our button and we'll come back to writing the function. So let's say our function is def, I'm going to say submit action. Okay. And we're not going to pass anything in, and then we'll go in and we'll just pass it for now. Okay, and we're going to come back to this blank function in a second. Now let's create our button. So we could call this a submit button. It's going to be a tk.button, of course, because we're creating a button object. Then we've got to pass in a bunch of variables again, a bunch of arguments. So we're assigning it to the main window, of course, which is what we've done every time before now, yeah, root. And then we're going to set the text of the button, we'll set the font, background, foreground, and then the new thing for this particular type of widget is the command. So everything up until command should seem familiar because we've just done it in our other widgets. So let's say text is equal to submit. That's what's going to show in the button. Let's say font, I'm going to go with Arial and we'll go size 12. That seems fine. Now let's set the background and foreground. So BG, how about we go with hex, I'm going to go 007 BFF. BFF even, it's your best friend for life, or best friend forever, isn't that how it is? So foreground, and let's say it's white, because you can pass in basic colors like that too. And now the final bit is the command. And for command, we're going to be saying submit action. Now, of course, at the moment, this would do nothing because we have not actually defined the function, but we have now assigned the function as what happens when you click on this button. That's the important part. And we'll finish the wiring in a minute. So now we've got our button. Let's do what we did before, which is packing to place it in the window. Again, we'll add some vertical spacing. So submit button dot pack, and then pad y, we'll say 10. Okay, now we need to come back to this function. We've got a function that we're going to be calling when we click on our submit button. And what do we want to do? Well, like I said, we want to essentially retrieve the text from the entry field and then display it in a pop-up message. So how can we do that? Well, we know that user input is going to be the text field, right? So we've got our text field variable here. Let's create a variable in here, user input, and let's make that equal to .get. I'm calling the get method on this object. That's part of the entry class. And with that, I'm fetching the text from the field and assigning it to a new variable. Now let's say the following, okay? So I want to see if there is something in that. If it is blank, we do nothing. If there is something, we do something. So let's say if user input strips, we're getting rid of all white space. If it isn't blank, this is going to be true. So then we go in here. If it is blank, it's going to be false. Then we go to the else method, which we'll write in a moment, or the else clause. Bearing in mind, strip is getting rid of all white space. And if all it leaves is blank, then this is going to associate and evaluate to false, which has nothing to do. So message box, remember we used the message box import here. Let's create a message box, show info, and then let's pass in the following. So this is going to be the title of the message box, input received. I'll capitalize that. Input received, this is the title of our message box. And then finally, let's add an F string, which just said you entered, gosh, my typing, bear in mind it's a new keyboard I'm using, so give me some patience there. You entered user input. Great. All right, excellent. So our message box is now going to have a title of input received, and then within the message box body, it's going to say you entered, and it's going to show the user input, which we have fetched here. And of course, we've stripped all white space leading and trailing from that. Now, if it in fact is blank, we need to do something. So else, we'll just say message box show warning. Now notice I use show info here. This is an informational box. A warning box is going to show something different altogether, of course, because it is a warning, right? So you've got different types of boxes. So we could say no input. So someone has clicked the submit button without adding any input, and we would just say, please enter something. Okay, great. So that has handled that, and that is our function done. This is a very basic function. Of course, you could do far more complicated things with your function, but what I'm doing at the moment in this is just illustrating how you can create a function, tie it to your button, and this function itself can interact with different widgets. And in this case, it's interacting with the text field. It is grabbing the text, and it could do something with that. So if you wanted to create a form to collect user data, you would grab that text, maybe you would process it, clean it, do something with it, analyze it, add it to a database, add it to a NoSQL database, add it to a pandas data frame, add it to anything that you wanted. But the idea is that you can do things with all of these different widgets, and you can make them all work together in clever ways. All right, so we have our button. That's all working great. So we've submitted the input. We have this submit action, which is doing something with that, and we're going to give what is equal to a message box, depending on what they've entered. Right, now we've done that. How about we add a final button, and this button just be a quit button to close the app. That can be really, really straightforward. And within that, we can actually set the command to just be root.quit. So we're calling the quit method on the root object, and that would essentially end the application and it would close it down. So let's just create a nice simple button called quit button. So equal to tk.button. Again, in the root window, text is just going to be quit. We could give it a font setting. We could say Arial, we could say size 12, give it a BG, what could we give that? We could say it could be hash, we could do DC, and then we could say the foreground is white, and then importantly, command, and we're just going to say root.quit. So we are basically doing this inline. This is very Pythonic. We obviously has this method associated with the root object anyway, so we can just call it directly within the command assignment here when we're creating our button. And finally, as always, we need to place this within the window. So we've got to use our pack method. So we say quit button, and once more, we'll add some vertical padding and we'll say 10. Excellent. So as you can see, this is a very basic button, and what it's going to do is it is going to quit our app once we click on it. Now, finally, how do we run this? How do we launch our app? Well, we would call the main loop method. And to call the main loop method, we would simply type out root.main loop. And that would then start our app. And we could save that. And we'd be set. We would have created a bunch of widgets. We would have created a window. We would have started the main loop, and everything should then launch. And we would have an application created with Tkinter running directly inside our computer after using Python. It's really straightforward. So as you can see, everything in here is good to go. So I could run this now, and we should see our app window pop up. How about we head on over to the terminal, and we can try running this and see what we get. So here I am. I'm at the terminal. I'm just going to go full screen with that. And what would we do? We would simply write Python, the name of the file, which is for me is Tkinter tutorial. I could click enter, and then I get the following app window show up. And there you go. It has worked. There's my text field. There's my submit button. If I click submit and it's blank, what do I get? Please enter something. Notice this has got a warning. So there's a warning window. If I enter something, so how about I be very literal? Something, you entered something. Great. If I want to quit, I click quit and it closes. So everything is working exactly as it should. We've done it. We have successfully created our first application using Tkinter. Now, one thing I want to say, we could leave this here and move on. But what we could also do, if we wanted to get clever, is we could use some object-oriented programming, or OOP. And what we could do is we could create a basic app using a class, and within that, we could pass in a root object as an argument to our class, and then we could use that root object within the initialization method to then basically set everything we've done here. So rather than using it all basically on its own, we could create a reusable app by using OOP. So how do we go about doing that? Okay, well, we've got all of this code. A lot of this code is great and we can still use it. We're just going to make a few small changes. We can basically copy and paste and slice and dice it around. So why don't I come to the top, and I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to move it into different parts of our class as we go. I'm going to create a class called BasicApp, okay? And within any class in Python, of course, you've got your dunders, and you start with init, and you pass in self and root. Now, I will say the following: if you are not familiar with OOP, this might start to seem a bit confusing, but this could be a great intro to it as well if you're brand new to the concept of OOP. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to make my application code reusable in a really neat and succinct way, and DIY principles, don't repeat yourself. OOP is ideal for that, right? So we're encapsulating everything within a class. And by doing that, it makes my application more modular, easier to manage. And in essence, the basic app class is going to encapsulate the entire Tkinter application. The root window is going to be passed to the class as a parameter, allowing all the widgets to reference the same main window, which is why it's nice and reusable and modular. And then we're just going to use a new method called createWidgets to organize widget creation, and we're going to reuse our submit action button to handle interactions. So it should all make sense once we get through it. But we've got our init. So I'm just going to create a bit of space here so it doesn't look too confusing. So I've got my init method here. So I need to set self.root is equal to root. That's the key part there, so we're passing in that parameter. Then I'm going to say self.root.title. Now notice I'm going to start duplicating myself here. Self.root.title is equal to what? Well, I could just take this, which I have here, okay? I could copy this and I could just say self.root.title is that. Then I could say self.geometry is equal to that. And I could say self.root.configure. I think you can see where this is going, is that. So I've taken this and I've moved it into here, okay? Now the only other thing I need to do is I need to call a new method, which I'm going to create in a second, called createWidgets. So this is going to be called createWidgets. This is going to be a nice organized way to create all of the widgets for our application. So I'm going to click pass for now. As with any method within a class, you have to pass in the self because that's the instance of the class it created. And I could just say self.createWidgets, and I would call that method within the initialization. So of course, I create a new instance of this class. All of this is going to be run. I'm going to set all of this. I'm going to pass in my root object. I'm going to assign everything. Then I'm going to call the createWidgets method, which is here. And within this, I'm going to create all the widgets we've just created. So this should all start to tie together quite neatly in a moment. So we've started off, we've taken all of this and we've moved it into there. So I'm going to delete that for now. Okay. Now what do I have? Okay, creating widgets. Well, I've got a label, a text field, a submit button, and a quit button, right? So what could I do? Well, I could say the following. Self what? I could say self.label. So I'm creating a new attribute called label. And what do I want to pass in? I want to pass in this, okay? Self.label is equal to that, right? And notice I have got root here, but this now has to be self.root because it is the root window associated with myself. That's the one change. Whenever we're using root in these widgets, we've got to associate it and assign it using self.root because that's how we're accessing root now. It is an attribute for this instance of the class. We pass in self so we can access root via self.root. All starts to seem quite neat, I think. Okay, so then we need to pack, right? So we've got this. So we could just simply say, all right, self.label.pack, great. I have now put my label into my widget. It is all set. I've got two labels there, so I'll get rid of that. And we have now moved our label into this create widgets method, and we've assigned the label as an attribute to an instance of this basic app class. What do you think we're going to do with the text field? Exactly right, exactly the same. So all I've got to do is go down self dot what? I'm going to call it self dot text field is equal to, I'm going to take this, cut it, paste it, delete that, and then I want self.textfield.pack. And notice again, self.root, make sure I do that, otherwise we're going to get an error. I've now put that as an attribute for my basic app class. So you can see we're doing the same thing over and over again. I'm creating a new attribute, I'm assigning it to this, I'm making sure we pass in self.root. So any new instance of basically a class from the TK class, I'm creating an entry object, right? So I'm assigning that to self.textfield rather than just textfield. And that means that it is accessible within an instance of the basic app class. Okay, so we've got that. What else do I need to do? Well, I need my submit button, right? So I'm going to quickly, notice I've got my submit action method here. I'm going to make this now part of my class. I'm going to call it a method within my class, okay? Right, so submit action is in there. And of course, because it becomes a method in a class, what does that mean? It means it's got to pass in self, because any method there has got to pass in self. Okay, and we're going to make some changes to that in a moment, so just bear with me, but it should be fairly clear where we're going with this, I think. So we have got that as a method, but we now have our submit button, of course. So let's just take this, put it there, same with our quit button, take that, put it there. Okay, so what do we want? We want self.submit button. Okay, and we want self root, and then we're going to say self.submit button. Okay, and then self.quit button, self.root, and then self.quit button. So I have now moved everything into here. Now notice I've got to do something with these calls, right? So this is now going to be what? Self.submit action. And what have I got here? I've got root.quit, but now it's got to be self.root.quit because I'm using the root object associated with myself. Excellent. So look, we have now moved all of our widgets into the create widgets method. We are calling that when we initialize an instance of the class, which essentially creates all these widgets in one go, nice and modular, nice and neat, nice and encapsulated. Now the last bit is to turn our attention to our submit action. Okay, what do we need to do in here? What do you think we need to change? Well, it's actually going to be really straightforward. Self.textfield.get, and everything else works. There's nothing else to do. That's all we had to change in there. So we have now created a class. Look what we have. We now have our own class called BasicApp. I've moved it all into there. And now we are ready to take this to the final stage, which is to create an if name equals main block, create an instance of our class, and run this. It's really, really straightforward. I think you'll agree this is actually a nice and neat way to handle this. So if name is equal to main, add a space there to make it tidy. Okay, if name is equal to main. So what do we want to do in here? Well, we've got to create a root object, and we're passing that in as the only parameter to an instance of our basic app class. So we've done that already. Root equals tk.tk. Seen that before. That is familiar to us. Let's create a variable called app. This is going to be basic app, and what do we pass in? Root. And look how that's now tied together. Look, the root object has now been passed in as a parameter to our basic app class. And look what happens. Root arrives here, we assign it here, we make all these assignments, we put it through here, and root is accessible in all of our methods and all of our attributes. And that is a very neat way to do it. And the final stage is to take our root.main loop here, and just move it there. Simple. We have now started the main loop for our root object. We have used our root object as the only parameter inside our basic app class, and we are done. So if I save that, what we can do is head back over to our terminal. We can run this with our new OOP approach, and we should see exactly the same behavior. Nothing's changed, but the way we've organized our code has now gone to another level. So let's head back over to the terminal, rerun this, and then what do we have over here? Drag it over. Our basic Tkinter app is back. Submit, no input. Add something else. Submit. Everything's great, and I can quit. And it works. We have now achieved our goal. There you have it, a basic Tkinter app. We've covered the foundational concepts like adding widgets, and these can labels, buttons, and text fields. We've used the message box, and we've styled them to make the interface more appealing. But beyond that, we've actually added some OOP, some object-oriented programming to show how we can encapsulate all of this code in a neat, reusable, and modular way. So hopefully you now understand the basics of Tkinter, and you can use this knowledge as a foundation for more complex projects. For instance, you could look at the image editor app that I've created, and you could look at other apps that I've created within this channel using Tkinter and have a better understanding of what is going on and how we're using Tkinter to create GUIs. Please let me know in the comments if there's anything that didn't make sense or anything you'd like me to cover in more detail. But thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.